So basically, this was going to be a post, but then it got really interesting and I got really lazy. So instead of trying to structure something, I'm just going to talk about. I annoyingly filmed this whole thing not thinking that I was going to put it on YouTube. And if you know me, you'll know that I swear a shitload. I realised if I'm putting this on YouTube, I should probably say a bit about who I am. My name's Abby. I'm 24. I have a bachelor's and a master's in history and art history. I'm a massive history nerd. I love talking about history, researching history, drinking beer, and I love attention. So that's kind of how this started. This is my first YouTube post. It's also my first time ever editing a video. So I'm aware that it's far from perfect, but I'm really looking forward to getting some stuff together. I've included the sources that I use in the bottom. Always wanted to do that. I will try to keep my kittens in everything that I post. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. I've had a few people ask me about pandemics, this country, the UK's response to pandemics. So I thought that I would just kind of talk about things that I had found pretty interesting. People have asked me if the way the country is currently responding is a unique case, or if the country has been in lockdown before. There have been a lot of pandemics and epidemics that have reached this country. Because I didn't actually intend for this to be a video when I started, I've only specifically looked at 2 case studies. So one is looking at how London responded to the Great Plague in 1665, and then the other is how the country reacted and responded to the outbreak of Spanish flu in 1918. So there's 300 years difference. So first of all, I was looking at the Great Plague of 1665. And I have this book, which is called A Journal of the Plague Year, and it's by a guy called Defoe, and it is an account of London during the plague and what life was like. I'm peeing and I suddenly realised that I didn't specify that the Great Plague was an epidemic within London. So this is a reflection of how a city reacted to it and not the country. So the Great Plague killed around 75 to 100,000 people, and that was 1/5 of the population of London at the time. I had a particular question from my lovely friend Alaska, who asked me if this is the first time in the country that pubs have ever been shut. So I was looking through this book to see if there was anything about pubs. And there was. During the Great Plague, pubs weren't shut. But, I've got this quote here, it says, all plays, bear baiting, singing of ballads, games, sword fighting were prohibited by the city mayor. Public feasting in taverns was also prohibited, but drinking in taverns was considered way too far and you couldn't ban it. Rather than banning them, a curfew was put in place. So pubs were open until 9 o'clock and then everybody had to go home. So during the Great Plague of London, pubs weren't shut. However, something that's similar is that Defoe writes about how the households of anyone infected could be locked up from the outside and kept under police guard for 20 days. It's interesting to compare how kind of similar measures have been taken today. Can't be bothered to analyse it, it's just interesting. So something that's important to mention is that Defoe was actually only 6 when the plague hit. He's writing 60 years later, but he relies on family testimonies, primary material, and it is considered a historically accurate account. So something that's really interesting is that when reflecting on his writing, Defoe quotes I've got here, they had no such thing as printed newspapers in those days to spread rumours and false reports of things, as I have lived to see practice since. The first ever newspaper was not actually produced in England until 1665, but newspapers weren't widely circulated until 1702. So shows that from when there's been newspapers, there's been fake news. So I'm now going to move on to looking at how the country responded to the outbreak of Spanish flu in 1918. But the reason it's actually called Spanish flu is because Spain remained neutral in World War I and therefore hadn't imposed a wartime censorship of press, which meant that when the flu spread from France to Spain, it received a lot more media coverage, and therefore people just assumed that that's where it started out, but it didn't. Spanish flu sucked, man. It infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide and is estimated to have killed around 50 million people. Sorry. Oh, it's my Instagram, I can swear. fucked up part is that it coincided with the end of World War One and killed more people than were killed in the First World War. The first reported case of Spanish flu in the UK was in May of 1918, and it reached its deadliest peak in October, so a month before war was over. So by mid to late 1918, officials were aware of how dangerous Spanish flu was, and a memorandum was drafted advising people to stay home and avoid public gatherings. However, because this clashed with the final few months of World War One, it was worried that this information would hugely affect the country's war effort, because it was so vital that men and women kept going to work in the factories and that kind of thing. So a guy called Arthur Newshome, who was the country's senior medical advisor at the time, scrapped the memorandum, and instead British people were advised to carry on as normal. And there's a particular quote from him saying, "The relentlessness of wartime justifies the risks of spreading infection." And this led me to find out something incredible, that the famous saying, "keep calm and carry on," while it was used in relation to World War II, actually dates back to this time, and words said by Newshome in regards to telling the country to keep calm and carry on as usual in their effort to end the war, regardless of what was happening with the Spanish flu. Because of this carry on as normal kind of mentality, I have concluded that Alaska pubs were not shut during the Spanish flu. As far as I'm aware, there was not a nationally implemented closure of public spaces. It's also probably worth mentioning that the concept of germ theory had only been around really well, so it was discovered in the 1860s, but it took a really, really long time for people to believe that there were microscopic, invisible things in the air that were making everyone ill. It went against established scientific theory, so regulations weren't followed as strict as they are today. People did wear masks, but I think that there definitely would have been a lot more individual cases where people thought, oh, that, I'm not doing that. This continue as normal mentality may have been responsible for the amount of deaths that the country faced, but at the same time, I guess it's really important to try and think of it in the context of that we were literally at war and in the final few weeks of war. So I honestly thought I was just going to be able to type in, have the pubs nationally been shut before? But I had to do the work myself. But I just think that if they weren't shut during the Spanish flu that killed 0.5% of the population, and they weren't shut during World War One or World War Two, their hours were just limited and, you know, precautions were taking place, and they weren't shut during the Great Plague, I'm gonna say no. So while I was looking to see if the pubs had been shut before, I came across this quote from a pub owner who was speaking in the beginning of March about the prospect of having to shut due to coronavirus. It is the Flying Horse Hotel in Manchester, and it's been around for about 330 years. And this is what the pub owner had to say. The pub had stayed open for some of humanity's biggest threats: smallpox, Spanish flu, 6 recessions, 2 world wars, the rise and fall of an empire, the start and end to our involvement in Europe, Napoleon, Hitler, and Mr. Blobby. I don't personally think that's funny. I'm just more including this to show that, you know, if he's telling the truth, then maybe it can be used as evidence to say the pubs haven't been nationally shut. But, you know, let's take it with a pinch of salt. So that concludes whatever the hell this was. I don't even know anymore. But I hope you learned some stuff and weren't too bored. I'm going to finish with something that's unrelated to everything I've just spoken about. But I didn't talk about the Black Death, and so I'd like to just briefly bring it in the end. So the Black Death came to England in 1348 and killed around 40% of the population of England. However, an unlikely effect of the Black Death was that some historians think that it gave rise to the invention of the British pub, and that's because the drastically high mortality rate meant that the period after saw higher wages, which meant more people were spending money, which meant more people were drinking ale, which commercialised the ale industry and brew houses and gave way to the establishment of pubs as a quintessential part of British culture. So I'd say like and subscribe, but there's nothing to like or subscribe to. So instead, I'm just gonna go get a beer. See you, bye. Ow, you